So, welcome to BNE's weekly video blog. I'm joined, my name's Ben Harris, I'm the editor of BNE IntelliNews, and I'm joined, of course, by Liam Halligan, who's our editor at large. Liam, we're just coming to the end of the month. We've just put another issue of BNE magazine to bed. And you were writing in your column this month about South-South trade. We just had the Victory Day here, and we had basically half the world's population represented on the stage with Putin. And although the West has been trying to isolate Russia with the sanctions, I mean, I thought the Victory Day was very sort of poignant in so much highlighted that there's this other dynamic going on, that the emerging markets, if anything, have been pushed together into a marriage of convenience, some are saying, but it's become a real thing, though, hasn't it?
It has. In my Invisible Hand column this month, what I wanted to do was highlight the extent to which the emerging markets, the developing countries, if you like, are now trading between themselves in trade flows that don't include the big Western countries. You know, Ben, as recently as the early 90s, just after the Berlin Wall fell, trade across the world, cross-border trade, was predominantly what we call north to south trade and south to north between the G7 countries and the emerging markets. South-south trade between the emerging markets was less than 5% of global trade.
Sorry, what exactly do you mean by South-South? I mean, we're talking here sort of Russia,
Yeah,
China, or?
Brazil to India, India to China, China to Russia, and all the other emerging markets in
Right.
between. South-south trade on the latest WTO numbers is now almost 40% of all global trade. That really is an incredible increase. As you say, since sanctions were imposed on Russia, we've actually seen closer cooperation between the big emerging markets, particularly China and Russia. They've signed two big energy deals. The so-called Silk Road trade route has been enhanced. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which now India wants to join after Putin went to see Modi in recent months, has got a lot stronger. And the fact we're getting all this South-South trade, it really says to me two main things. The first is that the usual Bretton Woods global infrastructure, global economic governance infrastructure, really does now look particularly outmoded. We need a lot more representation of China, Russia, and India at the IMF, at the World Bank, and so on. And the second thing it says to me, Ben, is that even though people say that decoupling is a myth, and in some senses financial decoupling is a myth because markets in the West affect markets in the East massively and vice versa, you do actually have increasingly some kind of economic decoupling, real trade flows on the ground where the emerging markets between them can generate their own trade and intra-emerging market prosperity, even if the Western world and the Western economies are on the skids.
Well,
And
this
that's a
is
very big change.
this is the thing. I mean, you're saying there's 40% already, but I mean, Goldman Sachs did a report on global trade, and they're saying that this is the huge mega theme going forward for the next few decades. Is that it's not so much the 40% of trade now; it's the rate that it's growing in, isn't it? I mean, it's gone from next to nothing over the last couple of decades.
As I said in my Invisible Hand column, you know, global trade has only grown by about 2.5 to 3% in each of the last 2 years, which is incredibly low by historic standards. There's been only one 2 or 3 year period since the Second World War when global trade expansion has been that low, and that was in the immediate aftermath of the second oil price shock in the early 80s, when of course you had 20% interest rates in the US, and a decimation of the American consumer. And so if you didn't have these massive south-south trade flows growing, global trade would now be at its slowest, at its most moribund for over 70 years, which is really an incredible thing because the Western world, despite all the hype and despite massive monetary and fiscal stimulus, hasn't yet staged a meaningful economic recovery post subprime. So not only is China now the world's economic locomotive, and you're seeing China using that leverage in its barbed exchanges this week with the Americans over the escalation of tension in the Pacific Basin. You're also seeing now China at the center of this south-south trade expansion, which
Hmm.
really is, Ben, the economic megatrend of our time.
Well, coming a bit closer to home, one of the big events in the BNE region, emerging Europe, was the surprise result in Poland, where the new president Duda came in at last minute, and it seems to be another sort of polling failure, following directly on from the British
Not
surprise.
a failure of all analytical prediction, Ben. We held, as you know, a BNE debate
Hmm.
in London a few weeks ago. We had Witold Subkał, the Polish ambassador here in the UK, and of course Charles Crawford, a distinguished ex-British ambassador in Warsaw, a very knowledgeable chap who's now left the Foreign Office but is still a very influential commentator. And at that debate, there were several participants and even panelists who were saying, we really think this could be a surprise result. We really think actually that Duda could edge this.
So the key question here, though, is some of the commentators have said, look, this is a swing to the right for Poland. They're particularly putting it into the context of the conflict with Russia. I mean, is this the case? Do you have a view on that?
I think it's inevitable that Westerners will see this election in terms of what it means for the ongoing fraught relation between Russia and the West. But it strikes me that this was really a domestic decision
I
by
agree. I mean, we had
domestic. We mustn't always see everything, always and everywhere through this
no,
post-Cold
indeed.
War.
We had Adam Annis, one of our columnists, who made this point. He said that there's a tendency to frame everything in terms of
Yeah.
pro-Russia, pro-Europe, and that Yanukovych was pro-Russia simply, but he wasn't. I mean, he was pro-Ukraine, and
So,
drilling in.
pro Yanukovych by the
Yeah, pro-Yanukovych filled his pockets with golden loaves. But talking to our guys in Poland, they're saying that this is more an expression, a protest vote by the Polish who were just tired of the same old elite running the country, and that they wanted to see a change, some fresh faces, and they sent a message. But in that sense, then this is a sort of symptomatic of a relatively mature political system, in so much as we had the same thing in the UK. People are getting tired of the same old elites, and they would look like a change, and so we have protest votes or in France with Le Pen. I think it's a similar thing. But then that compares very starkly to what's going on in Ukraine, which is an extremely young democracy. And we ran a chart there showing, I think it's something like three-quarters of the Ukrainians are disappointed with the government, which is struggling, to come up with the goods for obvious
That's
reasons. They have no
West and
money.
East Ukraine combined. It's a
Yeah.
West and East Ukraine, which is really a stunning poll. Just on Poland, Ben, I'd say, you know, let's look at the big picture here. Yet again, we've had a peaceful transfer of power
Yeah.
in Poland. There's been absolutely no question of any electoral impropriety
Yeah.
whatsoever. Just a couple of decades on from it being basically a dictatorship.
Yeah.
That's an incredible human achievement. This in a country that, of course, is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Yes, it has its problems, as we discussed at our panel in London. Yes, there's a very high dependence on inward investment. Yes, that can't go on forever. Yes, there's a demographic issue in Poland.
Yeah.
But this is a successful transition economy whose best days are ahead of it. And isn't it great that Polish people are now exercising their democratic right and they're tweaking and trimming their electoral system here and there to
Indeed.
get.
No, and this I think stands in stark contrast and underlines the point of that Russia's democracy, so they like to describe it, is still very young. And of course, we had this week that Putin made it now state secret for the number of deaths in special operations. In other words, any Russian soldiers who are fighting in eastern Ukraine who are killed, it's now illegal to talk about that number. This specifically is aimed at groups like Soldiers' Mothers, who have been in the forefront of highlighting this. But the youth of the democracy, in Ukraine we have exactly the same or a similar problem, in so much as that there's a TV station there called Inter that until recently was partly owned by Russians' First Channel. And there was supposed to be a meeting yesterday where the state is talking about pulling its license for not being sufficiently, patriotic. And I think the two laws may be slightly different in scale, but they both highlight again the issue of these countries struggling with what we take for granted in freedom of speech and more mature democracies like Poland, and its early stages, and they're all struggling with the same sort of issues.
Absolutely. I mean, Ben, you and I, we've spent many years of our adult lives in Russia. We've seen incredible advances in freedom of speech. We remember, the Kukli puppet show
Yeah.
of the 90s, quite astonishing spitting image style show in Russia. We've seen great leaps forward, but every now and then, things happen that really do make us think, oh, guys, come on, aren't you learning?
Yes.
And I thought the intervention by Putin that you mentioned was deeply disappointing. I think on Ukraine, what's really important now is to observe and to acknowledge that we are approaching some kind of rapprochement, I think, between East and West. Yes, of course, the ceasefire remains extremely fragile, patchy, but it's still just about there.
Yes,
but
yes.
you've now had, of course, meetings between Lavrov and John Kerry.
Newland, and they both, the tone is definitely warmed, and everyone seems to be looking for a way out.
And I think, as we've been saying in BNE for quite a few months now, in the end, it's going to be all about the economy. Yep. Stupid. You've been stressing in your tweets some of the numbers that have been coming out of Ukraine that have been really horrendous in terms of the hryvnia falling and low levels of growth. EBRD looking at minus 7.5% GDP this year, and that could be over optimistic. The European Union cannot afford to have a default on its fringes. Ukraine isn't a small country. The new Ukrainian finance minister is doing everything she can. She's not everybody's cup of tea, but she is doing everything she can to try and get some kind of resolution. And I think in the end, West and East will have to come together, maybe with some Chinese money as well, to put forward a package that can get Ukraine through this economic morass, because the IMF can't do it all, because there's no way Congress is going to allow a big bailout to pay the coupons on Ukrainian bonds when one of the major bondholders of Ukraine is the Russian government.
I think you need to be pragmatic. It's all very well to go into this and talk about ideology and principles, but the bottom line is that Ukrainian people at the moment are facing the same sort of moment that the Russians went through in around 1993, and that was a decade of hell at the basic level. And at the end of the day, people in these emerging markets, they don't want values per se. They just want a job. They want hospitals and schools that work. They want to be able to retire and have someone take care of them. The state.
They want a savings account and good dental.
Yeah, and Russia, for all its faults, and it has many, and it's been a very ugly situation. This remains a key part of the Ukrainian economy in terms of trade and what have you. And so we need to come to a point where people start to compromise, meet people in the middle. The EU have made it absolutely abundantly clear that Ukraine will never join the European Union. And therefore, Ukraine's been left in limbo. It's cut off from one of its main trade partners, and yet it's not going to be let into the other main trade partner. And so when people need to realize this fact, and then that means compromise. And of course, with the possible default on Ukraine debt coming up as soon as the next 2 weeks, these issues need to be addressed soon.
I'll tell you what, Ben, next time we'll discuss the EU's decision on whether or not to extend sanctions on Russia. Very different from Congress, of course, but my bet is that they won't.
That'll be a good one. Well, that's all we have time for, so thanks for watching. We're going to do this every week and bring in other guests intermittently. Take care.
Cheers.